Picture two rose bushes standing side by side. Same nursery, same week, same bag of soil poured into the same size hole. Fast forward to today, and one of them looks like it's showing off. Thick canes, glossy leaves, blooms stacked on blooms, practically bursting out of its own space. The other one? Sparse, leggy, sulking in the corner, with maybe 3 sad little flowers total. Nobody swapped the sunlight. Nobody swapped the rainfall. Nobody snuck in at night and gave one of them a better spot in the garden. So why is one rose basically doubling in size every month, while the other one barely moves at all? It comes down to a handful of specific things the fast-growing bush is getting, that the slow one simply isn't. Small, deliberate shifts that, stacked together, can push an ordinary rose to grow 2, even 3 times faster than it normally would. And I want to be upfront with you, this is a long one, because I'm not going to rush through these and leave out the why. Every single trick in this video comes with the actual mechanism behind it, the real biological reason it works, so that by the end, you won't just have a checklist you're blindly following. You'll actually understand your rose well enough to walk up to any struggling bush, yours, your neighbor's, the sad one at the garden center on clearance, and know exactly what it's missing. This isn't the tired, generic advice you've already heard 100 times. Give it sun, water it sometimes, prune it in spring. You already know that. What you're about to hear is the actual mechanical reason one rose sprints ahead and another one just sits there, year after year, going nowhere. We're covering 9 things in total today, not just a handful, because I'd rather give you the complete picture in one sitting than have you go hunting for the missing pieces later. And fair warning, the 4th one on this list is going to feel completely backwards. It's going to feel like you're deliberately sabotaging your own plant. Stick with it, because it might end up being the single most powerful thing in this entire video. Let's get into it, starting right from the moment water hits the soil. Trick 1. Stop drowning the roots. Start training them. Most people water a rose the way they'd water a houseplant sitting on a windowsill. A light splash, whenever they happen to remember. Just enough to wet the surface of the soil and make it look dark and cared for. It feels responsible. It feels like enough. And that one habit alone can quietly cut a rose's growth rate in half, sometimes more. Here's the mechanism, because the why is what makes this trick actually usable instead of just another rule to follow blindly. Roses are naturally deep-rooted plants. Left alone, a healthy rose will send roots down well over a foot, sometimes 2 feet, into the soil, hunting for consistent moisture and minerals that shallow soil layers simply don't hold on to for long. But roots are lazy in the best possible way. They only grow toward where water already is. If you give a rose a light daily sprinkle, the top 2 or 3 inches of soil stay damp almost constantly, and the roots have zero reason to push any deeper than that. Why would they go searching for water 12 inches down when there's already water sitting right at the surface? The result is a rose running on a... Trick 2. Keep the leaves bone dry. This trick is closely tied to the last one, but it deserves its own full spotlight, because it's quietly responsible for more thin, bare, struggling rose bushes than almost anything else gardeners do wrong. When you water from above and splash the leaves along with the soil, or when a rose is planted somewhere shaded and cramped where the foliage never fully dries out during the day, you are setting up exactly the conditions that 2 of the most common rose diseases need to thrive: black spot and powdery mildew. Both of these are fungal problems, and fungal spores need moisture sitting on a leaf's surface for an extended period to actually germinate and infect the plant. A leaf that dries within an hour or 2 of getting wet is mostly safe. A leaf that stays damp for 6, 8, 10 hours because it's shaded or crowded or got watered late in the evening is basically an open invitation. There's also a spacing issue worth mentioning here, because it trips people up constantly. If you've planted 2 roses too close together, or crammed one in beside a fence or a wall with poor airflow, you're creating a little pocket of still, humid air around the foliage, even if you never touch a hose near the leaves at all. Rain and dew alone will sit there for hours in that kind of pocket. So giving each bush genuine breathing room isn't just about looking neat in the flower bed. It's disease prevention baked into the layout of your garden before you've even planted anything. Trick 3. Feed it like you mean it, then add the secret weapon. A lot of plants in your garden do just fine on relatively poor soil, or even prefer it. Roses are not one of those plants. Roses are heavy feeders, genuinely greedy for nutrients, and a rose that's running low on food simply cannot grow fast, no matter how perfectly you've nailed watering, sunlight, and everything else. If your rose looks pale rather than deep green, if it throws one decent flush of flowers and then goes quiet for the rest of the season, or if its blooms are small and sparse instead of full, there's a very good chance the honest answer is that it's simply hungry. Start with the basics done properly. A balanced rose fertilizer applied as new growth kicks off in spring gives the plant the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium it needs to build canes, roots, and flowers all at once. Nitrogen drives leafy green growth. Phosphorus supports strong root development and flowering. And potassium helps the plant regulate water and generally toughens it up against stress, which is exactly why a balanced feed, rather than a single nutrient one, tends to work best across a whole season. Feed again after the first big bloom cycle finishes, because that flush takes a real toll on the plant's stored reserves, and it needs replenishing before it can gear up for a second wave. But here's the part that actually separates people growing a decent, average rose from people growing an absolute monster of a bush. An old trick that serious rose growers have quietly used for decades, and that almost nobody outside of dedicated rose societies ever talks about. Alfalfa. Yes, the same alfalfa that gets sold as livestock feed, in meal or pellet form from a farm supply store. You can scratch a couple of handfuls directly into the soil around the base of the plant and let it break down slowly, or, for a faster-acting version, soak it in a bucket of water for several days until it ferments slightly, then pour that liquid, often called alfalfa tea, around the root zone. Why does dried hay do anything at all for a rose? Because alfalfa naturally contains a compound called triacontanol, which behaves almost like a plant growth hormone once it's absorbed. It's particularly effective at triggering what growers call basal breaks, those thick, vigorous new canes that shoot straight up from the very base of the plant, right near the bud union. Basal breaks matter enormously because they're what actually rebuilds and expands the whole structure of the bush over time. A rose that throws 2 or 3 strong basal breaks in a single season can look like a genuinely different, much bigger plant by the time autumn rolls around. Feed the rose properly on schedule, work in the alfalfa, and you've handed it both the raw fuel and the biological trigger to actually use that fuel for aggressive new growth. Trick 4. Rip off the flowers before they finish. Here it is. The one I told you at the start would sound completely insane. To get more flowers out of a rose over the course of a season, you sometimes have to take flowers away from it first, occasionally, before you've even had a real chance to enjoy them. I know exactly how that sounds. You planted a rose specifically to look at roses, and now I'm telling you to go out there with pruners and cut some of them off early, or in certain cases, pinch the buds off before they even open at all. But once you understand the logic underneath this, it will genuinely change the way you look at every rosebush you ever grow. Here's the mechanism, because with this trick especially, the why is everything. A flower, from the plant's own biological point of view, is not there for your enjoyment. It has exactly one job: get pollinated, wither, and gradually transform into a seed pod, which on a rose is called a hip. The instant a rose successfully sets a hip, the plant receives a strong internal chemical signal that essentially says, "Mission accomplished. Reproduction is underway. You can stop investing energy in growth and flowering now." That signal causes the plant to slow down significantly because as far as its own biology is concerned, its job for the sun. So if you let spent flowers sit there on the bush, slowly fading and eventually swelling into hips, you are quite literally sending your rose the signal to wind down and coast for the rest of the season. Now flip that completely around. When you deadhead consistently, snipping off each bloom the moment it starts to fade, always cutting back to a strong, healthy set of leaves before a hip has any chance to form, the plant never receives that mission accomplished signal at all. As far as it knows, it still hasn't successfully reproduced, so it stays locked into what you could call striving mode, and it keeps pushing out fresh growth and an entirely new round of flower buds to try again. That's the real biological reason consistent deadheading produces wave after wave of blooms through an entire season, instead of one big flush in early summer, followed by silence for the rest of the year. A quick technical note on where exactly to make that cut, because a lot of people deadhead correctly in spirit, but slightly wrong in practice. Don't just snap off the dead flower head itself. Trace the stem down to the first set of leaves that has 5 leaflets rather than 3, and cut just above that point at a slight angle. That's usually where the strongest new shoot will emerge from, so you're not just removing the spent bloom, you're also setting up exactly where the next one grows from. Now here's the more extreme, more powerful version of this trick, specifically for a rose that's young or was only planted within the last year. In that critical first year, consider pinching off the flower buds entirely before they even get the chance to open, sacrificing that first season of blooms almost completely. It feels like a genuine waste in the moment, but every single bit of energy the plant isn't spending on producing flowers and eventually seeds gets redirected straight into building roots, canes, and overall structure instead. You give up one underwhelming season of so-so flowers, and in exchange you get a young rose that establishes itself far faster and far stronger, and that ends up outgrowing and outblooming its neighbors for years afterward. It feels wrong the entire time you're doing it, right up until the following spring, when you watch that bush explode with growth in a way its untouched neighbors simply can't match. Trick 5. Prune like you're not scared of it. If the last trick made you nervous, this one's going to test that same nerve, because the single most common mistake people make with roses isn't cutting too much. It's being far too gentle with the pruners. People give their rose a timid, apologetic little trim, snipping only the very tips, terrified of taking off too much and somehow damaging the plant. And the rose responds to that timid cut with exactly the kind of growth you'd expect from a timid signal. Thin, weak, twiggy stems that struggle to support decent-sized blooms. Here's the mechanism behind why hard pruning actually works in the plant's favor, rather than against it. A rose's root system stores a certain amount of energy reserves built up over the previous season. When you leave a bush mostly untouched with dozens of thin canes and growing points all still intact, that stored energy has to be divided up and spread thin across all of them, and the result is exactly what you'd expect. Lots of weak, mediocre shoots, none of them particularly strong. But when you cut a cane back hard, removing a significant portion of it, you're concentrating that same pool of stored energy into a much smaller number of remaining growing points. The plant answers back with thick, vigorous, fast-growing new shoots instead of a tangle of thin, disappointing ones, simply because there's more fuel available per growing point. So in late winter or very early spring, before the plant has fully woken up for the season, prune with genuine conviction. On most modern bush roses, that typically means removing a good chunk, often close to a third or even half, of the previous year's growth. But how and where you cut matters just as much as how much you remove. Always make your cut just above a bud that's facing outward, away from the center of the plant, because that particular bud is the one that will grow into the new shoot, and an outward-facing shoot grows away from the middle of the bush rather than crowding into it. Do this, trick 6, a cheap mineral most people skip. This next one is small, cheap, and honestly a little bit weird, but it targets two specific weak points in a rose's growth at the same time. The fix is magnesium, and the easiest, most accessible source is plain Epsom salt, magnesium sulfate, the exact same product sold in the bath aisle for soaking sore muscles. Working a couple of tablespoons into the soil around the base of the plant in spring, or dissolving it in a watering can and pouring it on, is usually more than enough to make a real difference. Trick 7. Blanket the roots and let them relax. This next trick happens entirely underground, out of sight, in the exact place where most of the real growth battle is actually decided before you ever see the results above the soil. A rose's root system is surprisingly particular about one thing above almost everything else: stability. Roots want consistent moisture and a steady, relatively cool temperature, and they genuinely don't handle sudden swings well. The problem is that bare, exposed soil around the base of a rose gives the roots neither of those things. Uncovered soil heats up rapidly in direct sun, cools down quickly at night, bakes hard and dry during a warm spell, and then turns waterlogged and soggy after a heavy downpour. Every single one of those swings acts as a small shock to the root system, and roots that keep getting shocked spend their energy coping with stress rather than pushing forward with steady, uninterrupted growth. The fix is a thick, generous layer of organic mulch spread around the base of the plant. Well-rotted compost, shredded bark, leaf mold, whatever organic material you have reasonable access to. Just make sure to pull the mulch back an inch or two from the actual stems themselves, so the base of the plant can still breathe and doesn't stay constantly damp against the bark, which can invite its own problems. That layer of mulch is doing several jobs simultaneously, all at once, for free. It insulates the soil underneath, smoothing out those harsh temperature swings so the roots can keep working. Light dries the overnight dew off the leaves quickly, and we already know from Trick 2 exactly why dry morning foliage matters so much. It's far less likely to fall to black spot, which loops us right back around to keeping those solar panel leaves clean, healthy, and fully functional for as much of the day as possible. Trick 8. Get the planting depth right from day 1. Now we're going all the way back to the beginning, because this next one is something that gets decided before your rose has even had a chance to grow a single new leaf, and it quietly shapes everything that comes after. It's about how deep you actually planted the bush in the first place. Most roses you buy from a nursery are grafted, meaning a specific flowering variety has been joined onto a separate, tougher root system, and the point where those two pieces meet is a swollen, knuckly bump near the base, called the bud union. Trick 9. Know when it's simply outgrown its pot or space. The last one on today's list is less of a technique and more of a diagnostic check, but it's one that gets overlooked constantly, especially with roses that were bought in containers. Sometimes a rose isn't growing slowly because of watering, feeding, or pruning at all. It's growing slowly because it's physically run out of room. A rose left too long in a nursery pot, or planted into a spot that's simply too small and constrained, will eventually become root-bound, meaning the roots have circled around and around inside that limited space until they're tangled and compacted, with nowhere left to grow outward. A root-bound plant can look healthy enough above the soil for a while, but underground it's essentially trapped, unable to access new soil, new moisture, or new nutrients, no matter how well you're feeding and watering it from above. If you've been doing everything right and your rose still seems stuck, gently check around the base, or, if it's in a container, slide it partway out and look at the roots. Circling, tightly wound roots are your answer. Few feet away that never really got going. Now you know exactly what separated them, because every single trick in this video points back to the same underlying idea. Give a rose the fuel, the room, and the signals it's actually asking for, and then get out of its way and let it do what it's built to do. Now I actually want to hear from you. Be honest with yourself for a second. Which of these were you getting wrong before watching this? For most people, if I had to guess, it's either the shallow watering habit or being way too timid with the pruners, and there's genuinely do. Now I actually want to hear from you. Be honest with yourself for a second. Which of these were you getting wrong before watching this? For most people, if I had to guess, it's either the shallow watering habit or being way too timid with the pruners, and there's genuinely zero shame in that, because almost every basic gardening guide out there tells you to do the gentle, cautious version of all of this, instead of the version that actually works. Drop a comment down below and tell me which trick you're going to try first, because I read every single one of them, and they genuinely shape what I cover in the next video. If this video actually helped clear things up for you, do me one favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing, and there's a whole series of these deep dive growing guides on the way covering other plants people constantly struggle with. Thanks so much for sticking with me through this one. Now go be a little braver with those roses, and I'll see you in the next video.